Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
Useless. That's the word my dad used right before he signed away my college fund to my brother. He didn't even hesitate, didn't even look at me when he said it, just sat there at the dining room table, pen in hand, acting like he was making a completely logical and justified decision. My mom stood by the counter, her arms crossed so tightly I thought she might crack, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to say something, but knew better. My brother, Ryan, sat across from me, smirking like he had just won some sort of prize, which in a way he had. I could already see the numbers running through his head, already picturing the cars, the parties, the easy life that would come from having something I had spent my entire life expecting, something I had worked toward, taken for granted, assumed was my future. But now, that future was gone, wiped away with a few strokes of a pen, handed over to the person who had already been given everything else. I didn't even know what to say at first, didn't know how to react because the shock was hitting me so hard I could barely think. "Are you serious?" I finally asked, my voice coming out quieter than I wanted it to, barely more than a whisper. My dad didn't even look up, just kept writing, kept signing his name like this was just another one of his business transactions, another deal made with no real emotional investment. "Ethan, let's be honest here," he said, finally putting the pen down and leaning back in his chair like he was about to explain something obvious to a particularly slow student. "You're not cut out for college. You've never been the responsible one, never been the one with a plan. Ryan is different. Ryan is going to take over the family business someday, and he needs this. You need to figure out what you're actually good at." I couldn't believe what I was hearing, couldn't believe the words coming out of his mouth. I had spent my entire life being told that college was the next step, that education was the only way to succeed, that working hard would get me somewhere. And now, at the last possible second, he had decided I wasn't worth the investment. "I have a plan," I said, my voice shaking, my hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly my knuckles turned white. "I got into college. I did everything I was supposed to do. You promised me this money." My dad scoffed, shaking his head like I was some naive little kid who just didn't get how the world worked. "You got into some state school," he said, waving a dismissive hand in my direction. "That's not a plan. That's just delaying real life. You don't know what you're doing. You'll drop out after a year, maybe two, and then what? You'll come crawling back here looking for help? I'm doing you a favor, Ethan. I'm forcing you to figure things out on your own." My mom finally spoke up then, her voice soft and certain. "Frank, maybe we should talk about this a little more." "Ethan," but my dad cut her off before she could finish. "This is final," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. "Ryan is going to school, and Ethan is going to grow up." Ryan still hadn't said a word, just sat there with that smug look on his face, that expression that told me he wasn't surprised by this at all. He had known. He had known before I did. That realization hit me harder than anything else because it meant this wasn't a last-minute decision, wasn't something my dad had just come up with on the spot. This had been planned. They had talked about this behind my back, had agreed that my future didn't matter as much as Ryan's did. I pushed back my chair, the sound scraping against the floor loud enough to make my mom flinch. "Fine," I said, my voice flat empty. "If that's how you feel, then I hope you never need anything from me. Because I swear to God, I will never forget this." My dad didn't even look up as I walked away, didn't call after me, didn't try to stop me. My mom did, though, grabbing my arm as I reached the door, her fingers digging into my skin like she thought she could physically hold me in place. "Ethan, please," she whispered, her eyes pleading, desperate. "Don't do this. Don't leave angry." I laughed, a hollow, bitter sound that didn't even feel like it came from me. "How else should I leave, Mom?" I asked, shaking my head as I pulled my arm free. "Happy? Grateful? Should I thank him for screwing me over?" She didn't have an answer for that, and I didn't wait for her to come up with one. I walked out the front door without looking back, without saying another word, without even grabbing my things. Because in that moment, I didn't care about anything except one single thought looping over and over in my mind. I was going to make him regret this decision for the rest of his life. Have you ever looked at your own family and realized they'd rather see you fail? Not just ignore you, not just dismiss you, but actively root for you to crash and burn, as if your failure somehow confirms that they were right about you all along? That was the thought that kept running through my mind as I lay on a half-broken couch in some guy's living room, staring up at a cracked ceiling, listening to the sounds of the city outside, wondering how the hell my life had turned into this so fast. I had left home with nothing but the clothes on my back and a couple of bucks in my wallet, convinced that I could figure things out, convinced that anything was better than staying in that house and being treated like I didn't matter. But reality had a way of hitting hard and fast, and within weeks I was drowning, barely scraping by, working 2 jobs just to afford food and a place to crash. During the day, I worked at a local diner, bussing tables, taking orders, smiling through gritted teeth at customers who barely looked at me. At night, I stocked shelves at a rundown grocery store, my hands blistered from lifting heavy boxes, my body aching from exhaustion, my brain so fried that I barely even felt human anymore. I tried to save what little money I could, but it was never enough, never even close to enough, because life was expensive and cruel and completely unforgiving when you had no safety net to catch you. I had no car, no real home, no backup plan, no one looking out for me. And the worst part? My father knew all of this, was fully aware of where I was and what I was going through, and he still refused to help. He still called me a loser every time I managed to get him on the phone, still laughed at me like I was some pathetic joke, like this was exactly what he had expected to happen. I told you this would happen, he had said the last time we spoke, his voice so smug and satisfied that it made my blood boil. You've always been soft, Ethan. You don't have what it takes to survive on your own. Just admit it and come back home. Get a real job. Stop pretending you're something you're not. I hung up on him before he could finish, my hands shaking with rage, my vision blurring from a mix of exhaustion and pure, unfiltered hatred. I would rather die than crawl back to that house and let him smirk at me like he had been right all along. I would rather live on the streets than give him the satisfaction of knowing that he had broken me. And then there was Ryan, the golden child, the favorite, the one who had been handed my future on a silver platter without lifting a single finger to earn it. I should have been the one in college, the one starting my life, the one making something of myself. But instead, I was here struggling to keep my head above water, while Ryan was living it up with the money that should have been mine. Or at least, that was what I thought, until I got a call from my mom one afternoon while I was on my break at the diner, sitting outside on the curb, eating a sandwich I had bought with the last couple of bucks in my wallet. "Ethan, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she should even be calling me. "It's about Ryan." I almost hung up right then and there, because I didn't give a damn about Ryan, didn't want to hear whatever nonsense she was about to say, didn't have the energy to care about his perfect little life. But something in her tone made me pause, made me listen, made me realize that maybe, just maybe, something wasn't right. "He dropped out," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ryan dropped out of college a month ago. He didn't tell your father. He just took the money and left." I sat there, sandwich forgotten in my hands, my mind racing, my heart pounding so loudly that I could barely hear anything else. "What do you mean he left?" I asked, gripping my phone so tightly I thought it might break. "Where the hell did he go?" She sighed, the sound heavy, tired, the way it always was when she talked about Ryan. "Vegas, I think. Maybe LA. I don't know, Ethan. He won't answer my calls. He took the money, all of it, and disappeared. Your father doesn't know yet. If he finds out..." I laughed then, an ugly, bitter laugh that startled the people sitting near me, made them glance in my direction like I was losing my mind. "Oh, he's going to find out," I said, shaking my head, feeling something cold and sharp settle inside me, something that felt a hell of a lot like justice. "And when he does, I hope he remembers this moment for the rest of his life. Because this was it. This was the proof I had been waiting for, the evidence that everything my father believed, everything he had convinced himself was true, was nothing more than a lie. He had chosen Ryan over me, had bet everything on him, had put all his faith and money into the wrong son. And now, he had nothing to show for it. That night, as I stocked shelves at the grocery store, lifting boxes that felt heavier than usual, moving through the aisles like a ghost, I thought about all the ways I could use this, all the ways I could turn this moment into something bigger, something more than just another example of how my father had failed me. And then, out of nowhere, my boss, a gruff old guy named Walter who had been running this place for decades, walked up to me, took one look at my face, and said something that changed my life. "You ever think about doing something bigger than this?" he asked, leaning against the shelf, arms crossed, watching me with a look I couldn't quite read. I frowned, confused, exhausted, not in the mood for small talk. "What do you mean?" Walter shrugged, picking up a can of soup, turning it over in his hands. "You're too smart for this," he said after a moment, tossing the can back onto the shelf. "I see guys like you all the time. Kids who got screwed over, kids who think they've got no options, kids who think they're stuck. But they're not. They just need to stop thinking small." I stared at him, my mind suddenly racing, the pieces clicking into place, the anger inside me turning into something else, something sharper, something more dangerous. Stop thinking small. That was the moment everything changed. That was the moment I realized I didn't have to just survive. I could win. I could be more than my father ever thought I could be. I could turn this whole situation into something that would destroy him, not just for now, but for the rest of his life. I wasn't just going to prove him wrong. I was going to make him regret everything. They thought I was useless, but I was just getting started. The anger inside me, the bitterness that had been eating away at me ever since my father threw me aside like I was nothing, had finally transformed into something sharper, something more dangerous, something I could actually use. I was done feeling sorry for myself, done barely scraping by, done living in a world where my father's opinion of me dictated my worth. I was going to rise, and when I did, I would make damn sure he never saw it coming. The first step was getting out of survival mode, out of the cycle of working myself into the ground just to afford a place to sleep at night. I still had no college fund, no safety net, no one backing me up, but I did have something more important: knowledge. I had always been sharp, always had an eye for numbers, always understood patterns better than most people. So instead of wasting time dwelling on everything I had lost, I threw myself into learning, spending every spare second I had studying anything and everything I could get my hands on. I spent nights watching free business lectures online, sitting in the corner of a 24-hour cafe, nursing a single cup of coffee until my eyes burned from exhaustion. I taught myself marketing, finance, coding, anything that could be useful, anything that could give me an edge. I had no degree, no fancy credentials, no connections to anyone important, but I had something better than all of that. I had desperation, and desperation made people dangerous. Every dollar I made, I saved. Every unnecessary expense, I cut. I lived off cheap instant noodles and black coffee, refused to waste money on anything that wasn't going to push me forward. I worked my jobs during the day, took online freelance gigs at night, grinding harder than I ever had in my entire life. And slowly, painfully, things started to change. The first time I made $100 online, I felt something shift inside me, something small but undeniable, like a tiny spark catching fire in the darkness. 100 turned into 500, then 1,000, then more. I started flipping products online, buying and selling, finding gaps in the market, exploiting trends before anyone else noticed them. It wasn't easy, wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was actually in control of my own future. Meanwhile, my brother Ryan was proving exactly how unworthy he was of everything he had been handed. The last I had heard, he was still bouncing around different cities, still blowing through the money my father had given him, still living like the consequences of his choices would never catch up to him. I wasn't surprised. Ryan had never had to fight for anything, never had to struggle, never had to feel what it was like to be truly alone in the world. And that was why he was going to fail. And then there was my father, Frank Carter, the self-made businessman, the man who prided himself on knowing everything, on always being one step ahead of everyone else. He still had no idea what was happening beneath the surface, still had no idea that his perfect little world was starting to crack at the foundation. His company, the one he had built from the ground up, had started showing signs of struggle, losing contracts, losing profits, but instead of adapting, instead of facing reality, he doubled down on arrogance. He refused to change, refused to admit there was a problem, refused to believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as invincible as he thought he was. I kept my head down, kept working, kept building. By the time I had saved up enough to take a real shot at something bigger, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I wasn't just going to make money. I was going to build something that could stand against my father's empire, something that could grow strong enough to crush him when the time was right. So I started my own business. It was small at first, just an online consulting gig, helping struggling businesses fix their marketing strategies, helping them adapt to the digital world my father refused to acknowledge. I took on clients, worked insane hours, made connections, built something from nothing. And slowly, my name started spreading. People started trusting me, started coming to me for advice, started paying me more than I had ever thought possible. And my father? He still thought I was a failure. He still thought I was struggling, still thought I was barely surviving, still thought I was the useless son who had wasted his potential. He had no idea that while he was sitting in his office pretending everything was fine, I was out in the world building something that would one day come back to haunt him. The day I made my first six figures, I sat alone in my tiny apartment, staring at the numbers on my screen, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to smile. Because this was only the beginning. And soon, very soon, my father was going to learn the biggest lesson of his life. You ever feel the moment when the scales start tipping in your favor? That slow, steady shift where you realize that everything you've been working toward, everything you've been clawing and fighting for, is finally starting to pay off? It doesn't happen all at once, doesn't come in some big, dramatic wave. It happens in quiet moments, in the little wins, in the way people start looking at you differently, in the way your phone rings more often, in the way your bank account stops looking like a death sentence and starts looking like proof that you were never as useless as they thought you were. That moment came for me about 3 years after I had walked out of my father's house with nothing but my anger and my pride keeping me upright. By then, my consulting business had grown from something small and scrappy into something real, something that people in the industry actually paid attention to, something that was making me more money than I had ever thought possible. What had started as a one-man operation had turned into a full-fledged company with employees, clients, contracts, actual power. I had found a niche in the market that people like my father had ignored for too long, helping outdated businesses transition into the digital world, helping them stay relevant while old-school businessmen clung desperately to the past. The irony of it all wasn't lost on me. My father, the man who had built his empire on the belief that he was always the smartest person in the room, was too stubborn to adapt to the changes happening around him. And I was the one helping people like him evolve. People who actually listened, people who saw the value in what I was doing, people who were smart enough to understand that the world was shifting and they had to shift with it. And while I was rising, my father's company was slipping, though he would never admit it. For years, his arrogance had carried him, his belief that he knew better than everyone else keeping him from making the necessary changes to keep up with the industry. He had ignored trends, dismissed technology, refused to acknowledge that the world was moving forward without him. And now he was paying for it. I heard through the grapevine, through old business contacts, through mutual acquaintances, through whispers in meetings, that my father had just lost one of his biggest contracts. It was a multi-million-dollar deal, one that he had been counting on, one that he had believed was a sure thing. But in the end, the client had gone with someone else, someone younger, someone who understood the modern landscape better, someone who wasn't stuck in the past. I wasn't surprised. I also wasn't surprised when Ryan came crawling back home, broke, desperate, tail between his legs like a beaten dog. I hadn't spoken to him in years, hadn't heard a single word from him since I found out he had taken my college fund and wasted it on nothing. I had no idea where he had been, what he had done, how he had managed to burn through so much money so fast, but knowing him, it probably hadn't taken much effort. The golden child had fallen, and now, like every spoiled brat who had never been taught how to survive on their own, he was running back to the only safety net he had ever known. My mother called me one evening, her voice tight, exhausted, strained in the way it always was when she was trying to keep the family from crumbling apart at the seams. "Ethan," she said, hesitating like she wasn't sure if she should even be telling me this. "Ryan's back. He's not doing well." I almost laughed, almost told her that I didn't give a damn about how Ryan was doing, almost reminded her that he had made his choices, that he had lived his life with every advantage in the world and still managed to fail. But I didn't, because I knew what she really meant. Ryan wasn't just broke. Ryan was ruined. He had gambled, had partied, had made bad investments, had thrown money at ideas that never had a chance of succeeding. He had burned every bridge, lost every opportunity, destroyed every last dollar. And now, there was nowhere left for him to go. I could imagine it perfectly. The way he had probably walked through that front door, still trying to play it cool, still trying to act like everything was fine, still trying to pretend that he had it all under control. But my father wasn't stupid. Arrogant, yes. Delusional? Absolutely. But not stupid. He would have seen right through Ryan, would have known immediately that his perfect son had failed him. And yet, even with all of that, even with his favorite child standing before him as a complete and utter disappointment, my father still refused to acknowledge me. "You should come by," my mother said, her voice hesitant, hopeful, like she actually believed that this was the moment everything could be repaired. "It's been so long, Ethan. Maybe it's time. Maybe it was time." But not for what she thought. Because for the first time in my life, I had the upper hand. For the first time in my life, I was the one in control. And I was going to use it. They say revenge is best served cold. I wanted mine served with interest, garnished with the slow, creeping realization that everything my father had built was about to slip through his fingers. I had spent years waiting for this moment, working in silence, moving carefully, making sure that every single step I took was calculated and deliberate. I had waited, watched, and bided my time until the perfect opportunity presented itself. And now, finally, that time had come. Frank Carter had spent his entire life believing that he was untouchable, that his company was too strong to fail, that he was too smart to ever be outplayed. But the world had changed, and he had refused to change with it. His company, once one of the most respected in his industry, was now struggling against competitors who had adapted faster, thought smarter, moved quicker. He had been losing contracts, losing money, and worst of all, losing relevance. But in his arrogance, he still believed he could turn it around, still thought he could regain his footing, still thought he was the same man who had built an empire from the ground up. What he didn't know, what he never could have imagined, was that his own son had been positioning himself to take advantage of his downfall for years. Through a series of carefully planned investments, through intermediaries, through business partners who had no direct connection to my name, I had started quietly buying up a major stake in my father's company. It was a slow process, one that required patience, one that demanded secrecy, one that forced me to keep my ego in check every time I wanted to shout from the rooftops that the man who had called me useless was now unknowingly giving me power over his life's work. By the time I was done, I wasn't just some shareholder with a few insignificant percentages. I was his biggest investor. I had acquired enough influence to dictate decisions, enough power to steer the direction of the company, enough leverage to make him dance to my tune without even realizing whose hands were pulling the strings. And that was the beauty of it all. He had no idea. While I had been building my own empire, while I had been grinding and working and pushing myself past every possible limit, my father had never even bothered to check what I was doing. He had dismissed me completely, written me off as a failure, assumed that I had faded into nothingness the way he had predicted I would. He had never even looked at me long enough to see what I had become. And now, I was going to make sure he saw me. But before I could bring the final hammer down on him, there was another loose end that needed to be handled. Ryan. The last time I had heard anything about my brother, he had been sleeping in my parents' house, burning through whatever scraps my mother could give him, pretending that he was just between opportunities instead of completely and utterly lost. He had gone from being the golden child, the favorite, the one who could do no wrong, to being a pathetic, washed-up shell of a man who couldn't even look himself in the mirror. And then, one day, out of nowhere, I got a message. Ryan, hey man, can we talk? I had stared at those words on my phone for a long time, debating whether I should even entertain whatever nonsense he was about to spill, debating whether I should even bother responding. But curiosity got the best of me. Me about what? It took him a while to reply, like he was debating how to phrase it, like he was trying to find the right words to get me to care. Ryan, look, I know we haven't talked in a while, and I know things between us aren't great, but I need a job. I heard you have a company now, and I was thinking maybe I could come work for you. Just something small to get back on my feet, man. You know how things have been for me lately. I almost laughed when I read that. I almost threw my phone across the room, almost screamed at the sheer audacity of this man who had taken everything from me, wasted it, thrown it away, and then had the nerve to come crawling back, asking for a handout like he was the victim in all of this. He had never cared when I was struggling. He had never given a damn when I was barely surviving, when I was working myself to the bone just to stay alive. He had taken my future, and now, after throwing away his own, he expected me to help him? I could have ignored him. I could have blocked his number, moved on, left him to rot in whatever pit he had dug for himself. But something inside me wanted more. I wanted him to feel it. So I told him to meet me in my office. When he walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked smaller, weaker, his once arrogant posture replaced by slumped shoulders and hesitant steps. He was wearing a suit that probably used to fit him perfectly, but now hung loose on his frame, like he had lost too much weight, like he had been barely scraping by for longer than he wanted to admit. I let him sit there, let him squirm, let him try to figure out how to start the conversation. And then, when the silence had stretched on long enough, I leaned forward and smiled. You want a job? I asked, tilting my head, studying him the way a predator studies its prey. Tell me, Ryan, why the hell would I ever help you? He swallowed hard, licked his lips, tried to force a smile that looked more like a grimace. Look, man, I know we have history. I know I screwed up, but we're brothers, right? Families should help each other. Family. The word almost made me laugh. I leaned back in my chair, exhaled slowly, then said the words I had been waiting to say for years. I don't hire failures, Ryan. You should know that by now. His face crumpled, his hands curling in a fist on his lap, his whole body tensing like he wanted to fight me, like he wanted to scream, like he wanted to tell me I was being cruel. But he didn't. He just sat there, shoulders shaking, eyes burning, breathing hard. And then he left. I sat there for a long time after he was gone, staring at the empty chair he had been sitting in, feeling nothing but satisfaction. One loose end tied up, one more to go. Because now, It was time for my father to learn that the son he had abandoned was about to destroy everything he had ever built. I watched as my father's empire crumbled, and he had no idea I was the one holding the hammer. It didn't happen overnight, didn't crash down in some dramatic explosion. It fell apart piece by piece, brick by brick, decision by decision, until there was nothing left for him to stand on. And the best part? He never even saw it coming. For months, I had been maneuvering behind the scenes, making quiet moves, tightening the noose around his company while he sat in his office pretending that everything was fine. I had spent years studying him, learning how he did business, understanding his weaknesses, memorizing the way he made deals, watching the way he handled pressure. He always believed he was the smartest man in the room, always thought that his experience, his instincts, his so-called wisdom would keep him ahead of everyone else. But he had never faced someone like me before. He had never gone up against an enemy who knew him better than he knew himself. Through my investments, I had gained more control over his company than he could have ever imagined. I had positioned myself in places he never bothered to look, aligning myself with board members who were tired of his outdated leadership, making alliances with people he had dismissed as insignificant. And when the time was right, I started pulling the strings that would ensure his downfall. First, I made sure his competitors got stronger. I fed them information, whispered in the right ears, helped them position themselves as the more reliable option. Clients who had been loyal to my father for years started looking elsewhere, started questioning whether he was really the best man to handle their business in a changing world. Then I tightened the pressure on his suppliers, making sure that delays, shortages, and price hikes suddenly became his biggest problem. One by one, the cracks started showing. One by one, the people he had once relied on started walking away. He still refused to admit what was happening. He still clung to the belief that he could fix things, that he could turn it all around, that he was just going through a rough patch. But rough patches don't last this long. Rough patches don't make the banks start questioning your financial stability. Rough patches don't make your investors start looking for ways to pull their money out before it's too late. And then finally, the moment I had been waiting for arrived. His biggest investor, one of the last people keeping him afloat, decided to pull out. Without that money, without that backing, his company would collapse under the weight of its own debt. There was no way out, no backup plan, no last-minute miracle to save him. For the first time in his life, my father was truly powerless. I heard about it before he even had a chance to react. I had people inside his company feeding me information, watching him, reporting back on every desperate move he made. He's calling for an emergency board meeting, one of my contacts told me over the phone. He's looking for an investor to step in. If he doesn't find one, he's done. I had waited years for this moment, had spent every waking hour working toward this outcome. And now it was here. I had one last move to make. The day of the board meeting, I walked into that building like I owned the place. Because in a way I did. The receptionist looked up at me, confused, clearly unsure of whether she should stop me, but I didn't give her the chance to speak. I just smiled, nodded, and kept walking, my footsteps echoing through the halls, my heart steady, my mind sharp. When I reached the boardroom, I didn't bother knocking. I just pushed the doors open and stepped inside, watching as the room fell silent, watching as my father's eyes landed on me, watching as confusion, then disbelief, then something dangerously close to fear flickered across his face. I took my time walking to the head of the table, letting the weight of the moment settle over the room, letting them all feel the shift that was about to take place. And then, finally, I sat down, folded my hands in front of me, and met my father's gaze with a look I had been saving for years. "Hello, Dad," I said, my voice calm, steady, completely in control. "I hear you're looking for an investor." For the first time in his life, my father looked at me with fear, and it was the most satisfying moment I had ever experienced. He sat there at the head of the long mahogany conference table, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw so tight I thought his teeth might crack under the pressure. The boardroom was silent, filled with the kind of tension that felt thick enough to suffocate, every executive and investor watching with wide, uncertain eyes as they tried to make sense of what was happening. They all knew Frank Carter as a man who controlled every room he walked into, a man who never backed down, never showed weakness, never lost. But now, sitting across from me, staring at me like I was some ghost from his past come back to haunt him, he looked small. I let the silence stretch, let the weight of it sink into the walls, let him sit there with his thoughts running wild, his pride and arrogance fighting against the truth that was staring him in the face. He had no idea how this had happened, no idea how his own son, the one he had thrown away like an afterthought, the one he had called useless, the one he had refused to invest in, was now the person standing between him and complete ruin. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough, forced, like he had to push the words through a throat that was too dry, too tight, too full of the disbelief that was eating him alive. "This is a joke," he muttered, shaking his head, his fingers drumming against the table as he tried to compose himself. "You don't have the money for this. You're bluffing." I smiled then, slow and deliberate, letting him see just how wrong he was. "No bluff," I said, reaching into my briefcase and pulling out a neatly stacked folder filled with every piece of paperwork he needed to see. Every contract, every financial statement, every detail that spelled out the truth of what had been happening right under his nose. I slid it across the table toward him, watched as he hesitated, watched as his fingers twitched slightly before he finally grabbed it and flipped through the pages. The more he read, the paler he became. The truth was undeniable. I had spent years positioning myself for this exact moment, quietly taking over enough shares, aligning myself with the right board members, buying out key investments, and ensuring that, when the time came, I would be the one holding all the power. He had been so distracted, so busy believing in his own invincibility, so caught up in his outdated belief that he was the only person capable of running this company, that he had never even seen me coming. "You." He swallowed hard, his voice barely more than a whisper now, his confidence bleeding out of him with every second that passed. "You did this?" I tilted my head, feigning curiosity, pretending that his shock was something I hadn't expected, pretending that his realization wasn't the exact reaction I had spent years crafting. "Of course I did," I said, my tone casual, almost amused. "Did you really think I was just going to disappear? Did you really think I was going to let you destroy my future and walk away like nothing happened? You bet everything on Ryan. And where did that get you?" I leaned forward then, resting my elbows on the table, dropping my voice just enough to make sure every word hit him exactly the way I wanted it to. "You made the wrong choice, Dad. And now you're going to pay for it." His breath came fast now, his nostrils flaring, his fingers tightening around the edges of the folder like he wanted to rip it in half. But no amount of anger or frustration or stubborn pride was going to save him now. He was backed into a corner, and for the first time in his life, there was no way out. I sat back, crossed my arms, and let out a slow breath, pretending to consider something, letting the room hang in suspense before finally offering him a way out. "It doesn't have to be like this," I said, watching as his eyes snapped up to mine, desperate for any sliver of control he could grab onto. "I'm willing to make a deal." His fingers twitched, his whole body rigid, his businessman instincts taking over as he latched onto the possibility of an escape. "What kind of deal?" he asked, his voice gruff, forced, like it pained him to acknowledge that I was the one dictating the terms now. I let the moment stretch, savoring the anticipation, the tension, the way the room felt like it was teetering on the edge of something monumental. And then I gave him the only offer he was ever going to get. "I'll bail you out," I said, my voice cool, controlled, absolute. "I'll save this company. I'll keep your name from becoming a laughingstock. I'll make sure you don't lose everything." I leaned forward again, this time letting my words sharpen, letting them slice through the last shreds of his pride. "But you have to publicly admit that you were wrong about me. You have to go on record, in front of the entire board, in front of the press, in front of everyone, and acknowledge that you were wrong. Wrong to write me off. Wrong to ignore me. Wrong to give my future to Ryan. You stand up and you say it, loud and clear, for the whole world to hear. And if you do that, I'll save you." The room was so silent, I could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. My father's face darkened, his entire body rigid with fury, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought he might break his own teeth. He was a proud man, a man who had built his entire reputation on never admitting defeat, never backing down, never showing weakness. And that was exactly why I knew he would never take the deal. His pride was more important to him than survival. And I had counted on that. Slowly, he stood, his chair scraping against the floor as he pushed it back, his fingers gripping the edge of the table as he glared down at me with all the rage and resentment he had probably been holding on to for years. "I would rather burn this company to the ground than beg you for help," he spat, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. I nodded, barely able to suppress the smirk that threatened to break across my face. "Then I guess that settles it," I said, standing to match him, leveling him with a look so calm it only seemed to enrage him further. "Because that's exactly what's going to happen." I turned without another word, walking out of the boardroom as the weight of his failure crushed him from the inside out. And as I stepped into the hallway, my heart steady, my mind sharp, my entire body thrumming with the satisfaction of knowing that I had won, I didn't feel regret. I didn't feel guilt. I felt power. And I wasn't done yet. Revenge tasted sweet, but was it worth it? That question had been gnawing at the edges of my mind ever since I walked out of that boardroom, leaving my father to drown in the consequences of his own arrogance. I had spent years planning this, working toward it, shaping my entire life around the moment when I would finally have the power to take back everything he had stolen from me. And now that it was done, now that I had shattered his legacy, stripped him of his pride, left him standing in the wreckage of the empire he had once ruled, I thought I would feel something more than this hollow satisfaction settling in my chest. His company had crumbled faster than even I had expected, collapsing under the weight of bad investments, outdated strategies, and the final push I had given it when I pulled out my stake and let the whole thing implode. The board had abandoned him almost immediately, cutting their losses, jumping ship before they went down with him. Clients who had once begged for his attention now refused to take his calls, distancing themselves from the disaster his name had become. Banks had turned their backs, investors had written him off, and within weeks, the man who had once looked at me with nothing but disappointment was now the one being pitted, whispered about, avoided like a ghost of failure. And Ryan? Ryan was exactly where he had always been, lost, desperate, scrambling for some way to escape the consequences of his own stupidity. He had spent his entire life believing that things would always work out for him, that there would always be someone there to catch him when he fell, that his last name alone would be enough to keep him afloat. But now, with my father ruined, there was no one left to save him. He had burned every bridge, exhausted every favor, and now, like a parasite that had finally drained its host dry, he had nowhere left to turn. I knew he had been trying to get a job, trying to convince old friends to help him, try to find a way back into the life he had once taken for granted. But the world had moved on without him, and he was just another washed-up failure with nothing to offer. The last I heard, he was sleeping in cheap motels, spending what little money he had left on alcohol and bad decisions, spiraling in the way that people like him always did when reality finally caught up to them. And then there was my mother. Linda had never been cruel to me, never been outright malicious like my father had, never taken pleasure in my pain the way Ryan did. But she had been complicit. She had let it happen, had watched as my father stole my future, had stood by while Ryan took everything I had earned, had stayed silent when she should have spoken. And now, after everything, after all these years, she was the only one left still reaching for me, still trying to fix what had been broken, still trying to pretend that we could be a family again. She called me more times than I could count, leaving voicemails that I never returned, sending texts that I read but never answered, begging me to talk to her, to meet with her, to give her a chance to explain. And for a long time, I ignored her, convinced that I didn't owe her anything, that she had made her choice the same way my father had, that she could live with the consequences the same way he did. But then one day I got a message that made me stop. Linda, the house is going up for auction. I thought you should know. That house, the house I had grown up in, the house where my father had made me feel like I would never be enough, the house where I had sat at the dining room table and listened as he told me my future didn't matter, the house where I had walked out for the last time, swearing that I would never come back. It was being sold, because my father couldn't afford to keep it anymore, because the life he had built was finally completely gone. I hadn't set foot in that house since the day I left, hadn't even driven past it, hadn't allowed myself to think about it for more than a few fleeting moments of bitter nostalgia. But now, standing outside in the driveway, looking up at the place that had once felt like a prison, I realized something. I didn't feel anything. No anger, no sadness, no regret, just nothing. The auction had barely drawn a crowd. A few real estate investors, some curious neighbors, a handful of people looking to buy the property at a fraction of what it had once been worth. And then, of course, there was me. I didn't hesitate when the bidding started. I raised my hand, made my offer, watched as the other bidders dropped out one by one, unwilling to go up against someone who clearly wasn't going to lose. And then, just like that, the house belonged to me. I owned it. I owned everything. A week later, I got a call from my mother. She didn't ask how I was doing, didn't try to make small talk, didn't try to pretend that this was anything other than what it was. She just took a shaky breath and asked, "What are you going to do with the house?" I let the silence stretch between us, let her sit with the weight of the question, let her wonder if I was going to burn it to the ground, sell it for parts, let it rot until the walls caved in. And then, finally, I answered, "I haven't decided yet." And I hadn't, because standing there looking at that house, knowing that I could do whatever I wanted with it, knowing that I had the power to decide whether my parents had a roof over their heads or whether they had to beg for a place to sleep, knowing that I was the one holding their future in my hands, it didn't feel as good as I thought it would. I had won. I had everything I had ever wanted. I had destroyed my father, humiliated my brother, taken back what had been stolen from me. But now that I had it, was it enough? I didn't know, and maybe I never would.